planning for a war Germany couldn't supply. It remains one of the central paradoxes of the German invasion in 1941. The Wehrmacht prepared for the most extensive land campaign in history using a logistical model never intended for such a scale. Their supply system had been designed for compact, short-lived drives across Belgium, the Netherlands, or France, countries with dense transport networks and rail gauges already compatible with German standards. Moving divisions in those environments meant short supply lines, where trucks could deliver rations and ammunition directly from depots to the front within a day. The Eastern Theater, however, stretched across thousands of kilometers of sparsely developed land, much of it with different infrastructure altogether. German officers understood these realities in broad terms, but entered the campaign planning as if sheer speed and aggression would erase such limitations. In truth, the campaign's sustainability was compromised from the very outset because preparations assumed a war too short for logistical strain to matter. Once the advance carried deep into the Soviet Union, those misplaced assumptions gave way to accumulating shortages that proved impossible to recover from. The entire plan hinged on Blitzkrieg tactics, a swift, decisive strike meant to bring the Red Army to collapse within weeks. The concept had worked in France, where the Wehrmacht's armored groups reached the Channel coast in mere days. In Russia, that same approach meant traversing over 1,000 kilometers simply to close on Moscow. Yet the planning cycle continued to operate on the model of Western campaigns. Supply branches were assured the fighting would last no more than 3 months. Deliveries of spare parts, fuel reserves, and winter clothing were not pressed as urgent because leaders assumed that by autumn, the Soviet Union would be forced to capitulate. What looked like optimism in 1940 and 1941 later revealed itself as negligence. The transportation systems and reserves required for deeper operations had not been organized, and the moment German columns rolled eastward, every additional mile magnified the stress. Once the invasion began, the mismatch grew undeniable. Armored spearheads surged across the frontier, but the units responsible for feeding them trailed far behind. German records from the supply branch show that by the third week of the operation, fuel requests went unanswered or were fulfilled days late. Formations halted not because of Soviet resistance, but because the last canisters of gasoline had been emptied. Trucks drove for hundreds of kilometers over rough, unpaved routes, breaking down in vast numbers. Even at the start, Germany did not enter the campaign as a fully motorized army. While Nazi propaganda celebrated mechanized columns, in practice the Wehrmacht relied heavily on motor transport, but still used hundreds of thousands of horses in 1941. These animals pulled roughly 2/3 of supply wagons, hauling ammunition, water, and barrels of fuel. Exhaustion among the horses accumulated quickly in the heat of summer, creating another vulnerability. The supposed mobility of German divisions was in reality chained to living creatures unable to withstand such demands. Railways could have offset the burden, but there too the assumptions collapsed. Soviet tracks were built on a broader gauge, which meant German trains could not use them until engineers physically dismantled and rebuilt the lines. The conversion process lagged far behind the army's speed. As armored groups pressed forward, they outdistanced the usable railheads by hundreds of kilometers. Supplies piled up west of the frontier because the new lines remained incomplete. By August 1941, spearhead units had advanced so far beyond their logistical base that basic rations and spare parts moved at a crawl. Infantry formations fell back on requisitioning food from civilians, stripping towns and villages for grain, while workshops dismantled wrecked vehicles to scavenge usable components. The practical results quickly filtered down to the men on the line. Soldiers began recording shortages long before the onset of winter. In diaries, they described going hungry in midsummer when regular rations failed to arrive. Ammunition had to be counted out bullet by bullet in firefights, as commanders held back reserves for future engagements. Newly released quartermaster reports show that within weeks of the campaign's start, officers were warning Berlin that the army was living from exhaustion. Truck strength dropped by nearly 40% in the first 4 months. Fuel losses during transport through breakdowns, evaporation in leaky barrels, or seizure by partisan attacks, reached levels so significant that operational orders became detached from what could actually be done. The paradox of battlefield success worsening the supply crisis appeared almost immediately. Panzer groups achieved great encirclements, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. Yet within their captured territory, German formations lacked sufficient food even to provision themselves, let alone their prisoners. Officers reported situations where guards and captives alike were starving as supply convoys failed to arrive. What looked like triumph on an operational map in practice created more mouths to feed and more strain on convoys already overloaded. In the east, distance itself was often the deadliest opponent. Every kilometer taken meant another kilometer that wagons, trucks, and rail crews had to cover, with capacity that never matched demand. Nor did the much-anticipated resources of conquered regions provide relief. German planners had assumed that occupied Soviet farmland would feed their armies. Instead, systematic scorched earth tactics destroyed harvests before invaders could seize them. Villagers concealed supplies or had abandoned them altogether. In some areas, German officers found more ashes than grain. Local requisition thus produced meager results, and the Wehrmacht sank deeper into dependence on overstretched convoys. The outcome was a self-defeating cycle. The more territory gained, the longer the supply tail grew, and the less effective the occupation became. It is important to emphasize that these issues were not temporary problems to be corrected with more time. They reflected structural contradictions. The German economy could not produce enough trucks to replace the tens of thousands destroyed or abandoned. Rail reconstruction never kept up with the velocity of the advance. Fuel demand grew beyond what the available transport system could deliver. These shortages did not disappear with better planning. They remained constant throughout the campaign and into 1942. The invasion had been built as though the army would never need to operate far from its starting lines. When that prediction failed, there was no fallback plan. The German commanders themselves were aware of the contradictions. Reports from the field often paired descriptions of celebrated battles with blunt admissions that fuel, ammunition, and food were running out. Victories that captured Soviet armies came paired with requests for thousands of replacement trucks or for fuel that never arrived. The entire design of the attack assumed the size of France or Belgium, but thrust itself into a territory several times larger. What unfolded was a relentless exposure of the fact that Germany had mobilized men and weapons for a short, decisive war, while omitting the logistical backbone that might sustain a long one. By the end of 1941, this flaw was impossible to ignore. The advance had stalled outside major Soviet cities not only because of resistance, but because German schedules, depots, and stockpiles had collapsed under demands never met. In that sense, the supply system was not simply failing. Its limitations set the boundaries of what the German army could hope to achieve. Where materiel did not flow, victory could not be consolidated. The invasion carried the likelihood of eventual failure within it, because its foundations never matched the territory it sought to dominate. This left Germany in a position of severe contradiction, an army still capable of destroying opponents in set battles, but unable to convert those triumphs into lasting strategic control. Its own infrastructure, its reliance on animal power in a mechanized age, and its misplaced assumptions condemned it to an unwinnable contest. And while this weak link shaped the operational rhythm from the first weeks, an even broader misjudgment haunted the German leadership, the belief that their adversary was too weak to withstand such pressure. That perception, rooted in recent conflicts and ideological arrogance, proved as decisive as the supply failures that undermined every plan. Myth of a weak Soviet Union. The German leadership entered 1941 convinced that the Soviet Union was fragile. Their judgment rested heavily on what they had seen during the Soviet-Finnish Winter War of 1939–40. Soviet divisions that had looked disorganized, supply failures frequent, and casualties severe. Hitler and his planners concluded that the Red Army might be vast in numbers, but hollow in effectiveness. They believed the Soviet state survived only by force and propaganda, and that once German armies seized its major cities, the structure would collapse altogether. This was less an assessment of reality than a reflection of ideological bias, and it shaped the entire invasion plan. The reality was more complex. The Winter War's poor showing came at the height of Stalin's purges, when much of the officer corps had been removed and new commanders thrust into roles they were unprepared for. Soviet weaknesses in Finland showed the cost of that disruption, not the permanent state of the Red Army. By 1940, reforms were already in motion to rebuild command structures, reorganize formations, and modernize equipment. The Soviet government knew Germany posed the main threat, and preparations were underway even before Operation Barbarossa began. Key factories were dismantled and relocated hundreds of kilometers east to the Ural Mountains, where they were out of reach of German aircraft. This relocation of industry, vast in scope and carried out with precision planning, ensured that production not only survived the invasion, but eventually expanded. The Soviet leadership demanded enormous sacrifices to make this mobilization possible. Factories disassembled brick by brick were reassembled in the Urals or Siberia. Workers, technicians, and their families traveled with the machinery, setting up entire industrial towns overnight. Women and teenagers took up factory jobs in huge numbers, while older workers endured punishing hours to keep production running. Families lived in makeshift housing near industrial complexes so that every resource went directly into sustaining output. Instead of collapsing under the invasion, Soviet industry moved, adapted, and hardened against attack. The relocation was one of history's most ambitious logistical undertakings, and it gave the Soviet system a foundation far stronger than German planners had imagined. The results became clear by 1942. Soviet industry, initially disrupted, quickly rebounded. Tank production surged, centered on the T-34, a model that proved decisive. Its design combined durability, sloped armor, and mobility while being simple to mass produce. Where German factories produced high-performance vehicles in relatively small numbers, Soviet plants turned out T-34s in the tens of thousands. This single vehicle became a symbol of Soviet resilience and technological competence, shocking German officers when it appeared on the battlefield only months into the invasion. By the following year, Soviet armor production had surpassed Germany's by a wide margin, ensuring that battlefield losses could routinely be replaced. Artillery and aircraft followed the same pattern. Relocated factories in the Volga and Ural regions produced enormous volumes of guns, mortars, and shells. Soviet doctrine emphasized concentrated artillery bombardments, which became more feasible as production climbed. Aircraft production also exceeded expectations. By late 1942, the Soviet Union was rolling aircraft off its production lines faster than the Luftwaffe could replace losses. German reliance on complex designs caused bottlenecks, while Soviet designs emphasized efficiency and scale. War reports show that Soviet squadrons could absorb devastating raids, yet field replacements within weeks. This capacity to replenish, rooted in industrial relocation and mobilized labor, overturned the assumption that Soviet resources would exhaust themselves within months. The reality on the ground reflected these shifts. German intelligence reports written in the autumn of 1941 already expressed surprise at the sheer number of Soviet replacements appearing on the front lines. Tank losses suffered at Smolensk or Kiev were offset by reinforcements that arrived in alarming numbers. German aircraft units destroyed hundreds of Soviet fighters on the ground, only to encounter fresh squadrons weeks later. The expectation that Soviet material losses would cripple resistance proved entirely false. Each month, the Red Army stabilized its lines with new equipment drawn from factories that had been reconstituted far east of the fighting. Lend-Lease aid from the United States and Britain added another layer of resilience. Imports of trucks, jeeps, and aircraft lightened the burden on Soviet factories, allowing them to concentrate on tanks, artillery, and small arms. By shifting transport production to outside suppliers, Soviet industry could channel more resources into heavy weapons. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of Western-built vehicles helped mechanize Red Army divisions and improve mobility. But the foundation of Soviet recovery was still domestic. Relocated factories, mobilized labor, and strict central planning that ensured material reached the front lines. The German assumption that Soviet inefficiency meant wasted resources proved deadly wrong. In practice, central committees oversaw industrial relocation with meticulous coordination. Rail deliveries kept materials moving, new mines in the Urals and Central Asia supplied metals and fuel, and evacuated populations provided a vast workforce. By 1943, Soviet production dwarfed German capacity. Stalin's system, for all its brutality, had created conditions in which the state could absorb staggering losses while increasing military strength. The early months of disaster had forged the mechanisms of recovery, and the Red Army that emerged in 1942 bore little resemblance to the army humiliated in Finland. The irony is that German aggression itself accelerated Soviet mobilization. By striking in June 1941, Hitler forced the Soviet Union into a total war footing immediately. Factories that might otherwise have been modernized incrementally were ripped up and shifted east with urgency. Populations that had little direct connection to the war in 1939 found themselves living beside the machines that produced tanks and guns. Entire communities became instruments of the war effort. German officers saw this only through its effects: sudden rises in Soviet firepower, unexpected reinforcements, and the persistence of an enemy they had assumed would collapse. By contrast, Germany's own economy stagnated under poor management and inflexible assumptions. While the Soviet state exploited its depths of territory and manpower, German planning clung to the idea that victory required only speed. When that bet failed, there was no path to sustain operations against an enemy that continued to rebuild its strength. The myth of a weak Soviet Union had created false confidence, leaving Germany unprepared for a prolonged struggle. This miscalculation shaped everything that followed. Instead of a summer victory, the Wehrmacht faced an opponent capable of absorbing defeats and returning to battle with even greater capacity. The Soviet Union was not a hollow empire held together by propaganda, but an industrial power that could relocate, reorganize, and outproduce its enemy. The T, rolling off the lines in the Urals, was the clearest proof that Hitler's assumptions had been catastrophically misplaced. As the Soviets proved able to survive the initial blow and replace what had been destroyed, German commanders confronted a different question altogether: how to carry out an invasion across such vast distances when their armies were already tied to fragile supply lines. It was into this reality that German forces launched their advance in 1941, splitting their offensive into three immense thrusts that aimed to capture everything at once. The three-pronged gamble. When German forces crossed into the Soviet Union in June 1941, they did so in three vast thrusts: north against Leningrad, center toward Moscow, and south into Ukraine. On maps, this broad offensive promised sweeping gains across a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles. But dispersing resources across such an enormous space only magnified the weaknesses of German logistics. The Wehrmacht lacked the transport, fuel, and cohesion to sustain three simultaneous operations at that depth. What looked like broad coverage translated into diluted striking power, leaving no single thrust able to deliver the decisive blow that German doctrine demanded. Army Group North advanced through the Baltic states with orders to capture Leningrad, cutting Soviet access to the Baltic Sea and striking a symbolic heart of the Soviet system. Yet poor terrain, stout resistance, and logistical weakness turned what had been envisioned as a rapid seizure into a prolonged siege. German planners had not anticipated the enormous manpower and supply burdens of encirclement. Reinforcements and materiel allocated to hold the blockade could not be spared for advances elsewhere. The objective that should have provided quick strategic results instead tied down strength in static warfare, sapping resources that were needed elsewhere. Army Group Center, by contrast, was the focal point of operational design. a direct drive toward Moscow. German generals understood Moscow's significance as both a communications hub and a political capital whose capture might splinter the Soviet state. Doctrine emphasized annihilation by encirclement, destroying concentrations of the Red Army along the way before striking directly at its center of gravity. But achieving this required concentrated power, not dispersion. Instead, the central thrust advanced with lengthening supply lines over poor roads and compromised rail systems. The need to support two other army groups starved it of the full logistical weight it required, setting the stage for a stalled climax outside Moscow. Army Group South had a different task: to seize Ukraine with its farmland, industrial capacity, and access to resources like coal and oil. This region loomed large in Hitler's vision, both for ideological colonization and for ensuring the Reich's economic self-sufficiency. Yet driving through Ukraine meant traversing enormous rivers, wide open spaces, and encountering unexpectedly strong Soviet resistance. The diversion of panzer units to capture the Kiev pocket made headlines across Germany with staggering numbers of prisoners taken, but it also exacted a hidden cost. By redirecting armor southward, Hitler inflicted a serious delay on the advance toward Moscow, a decision that his generals protested as recklessly undermining their best chance at a decisive victory in 1941. At first, the three thrusts looked like confidence in action, but within the German command, there was significant dissent. Senior officers warned that scattering strength over such distance crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to achieve a true battle of annihilation. Doctrine required overwhelming focus against an enemy concentration. Instead, the invasion pursued three primary objectives simultaneously, ensuring that none could receive decisive strength. Hitler's interventions compounded this. He insisted both resource-rich Ukraine and symbolic Leningrad were indispensable targets, even as his generals argued Moscow was the only prize that might end the war quickly. The result was a fractured strategy whose operational consequences soon became unavoidable. The trade-offs grew glaring by autumn. Army Group North stalled outside Leningrad, unable to finish its objective. Its presence fixed forces into a siege that consumed manpower and supplies, but offered little in return. Army Group South achieved spectacular encirclements around Kiev, destroying entire Soviet formations. Yet those victories were offset by the delay imposed on Army Group Center's advance toward Moscow. By the time panzer divisions were redirected back to the central axis, summer's window for a rapid attack was closing. The gamble to secure Ukraine's resources overrode doctrinal necessity, and the central assault moved forward weakened and behind schedule. Army Group Center's struggle for Moscow revealed how damaging these dispersals had become. Its tanks and trucks faced constant shortages of fuel and spares. The farther west the rails lagged, the more supply convoys overloaded. Reserves meant for a concentrated strike were bled away, diverted to other fronts, or trapped in endless delays. By the time German divisions closed on the capital's outskirts, temperatures had dropped, resistance stiffened, and the chance of a rapid victory evaporated. The decision to split concentration had cost the Wehrmacht the timetable on which its success depended. The logic of Blitzkrieg, decisive speed, concentrated encirclements, was well understood within the German officer corps. But the invasion of the Soviet Union represented its betrayal in practice. Instead of concentration, Hitler demanded division. Instead of clearly focusing on destroying the Soviet command center, he broadened objectives to secure resources, symbols, and ideological prizes. What resulted was the exhaustion of the supply system, the weakening of each offensive thrust, and strategic paralysis by the year's end. The soldiers at the front felt the consequences in immediate terms. Beside Leningrad, German units dug in for a blockade with winter closing in, lacking the strength to storm the city, but still bound to hold their positions. Along the road to Moscow, exhausted divisions crouched in inadequate shelters, tanks frozen in place with empty fuel tanks, rifles short of ammunition. In Ukraine, long supply lines grew vulnerable to partisan disruption as attrition set in. What had started a few months earlier as Germany's boldest offensive now revealed itself as overextension on every front. In Berlin, Hitler still insisted the advance remained within his control. To a professional soldier, however, the flaws were obvious. A strategy so dispersed it contradicted the very doctrine that had given Germany its earlier victories. Encirclements delivered massive Soviet losses in the short term, but the Soviet Union was not a small Western state. Its breadth of territory and capacity to replace armies meant those losses were not decisive. Without a blow at the center of gravity, destruction of field armies alone could not end the war. By late 1941, the three-pronged gamble had reached its limit. None of the thrusts had achieved their decisive objective. Leningrad endured despite the siege. Ukraine was occupied, but only through delays that undermined the campaign's timetable. Moscow stood unconquered, defended by fresh reserves drawn from the east, even as German divisions froze outside its gates. Supplies dwindled, morale sagged, and the strategic momentum that had defined German arms since 1939 finally broke. The gamble revealed itself not as brilliance, but as dispersal without decision. Germany held vast conquered areas, but nothing that forced Soviet collapse. The war had not been won quickly. Instead, it had become an extended struggle fought across distances that overstretched every capability of the Reich. For the soldiers trapped in worsening conditions, the failure of strategy was not an abstraction. It meant hunger, exhaustion, and the reality of being stranded deep in hostile territory. And yet, this only described part of the weight bearing on the German war effort in the East. Beyond strategy and logistics, the invasion was defined by another factor entirely: the deliberate political and ideological choices that shaped how the war would be fought on the ground. Those directives carried consequences just as profound as battlefield setbacks, and they made clear from the very beginning that this conflict could never follow the rules of conventional warfare. The Commissar order and war of annihilation.